You can't do relational ministry with 300 people by having 300 cups of coffee every week.
Right.
But we do think that if you have the right tools, then, and you know which 3 people need your attention this week, then you can do it across that many people. And that's where the sacred listening theory and tools come in.
Have you ever asked the question, how do we get young people back into the church? Well, here's the problem with that question. The reality is that most young people today, Gen Z and Gen Alpha, haven't really left the church. You know who left the church? Their parents left the church, the millennials and the Gen Xers. And so the Gen Z and Gen Alpha generations, they don't really have a church to come back to, which begs the question, does the kind of youth ministry that we did when we were young, does that even work anymore? Because kids today, most of them have no idea what even happens inside the walls of the church, and that can be really intimidating, right? When I was in high school, junior high and high school, if they had a pizza party, I would show up because that was a lot of fun, right? If my friends were there, if they played stupid games, I would show up because that was a lot of fun. Now, I was a church kid and that helped, but you know what? Most of the kids in my school had some experience of church, and if I told them, hey, we're going to play this, crazy game on Friday night, they'd be like, yeah, okay, I'll go. That doesn't really work anymore. It worked when I was in college. I was involved in Campus Crusade for Christ. It even worked when I was a youth pastor in the early 2000s. And we would have fun games and fun crazy stuff going on the weekends, and that would bring the kids in, and then they might come on Wednesday night or even on Sunday morning for Sunday school. That doesn't really work anymore. So the question is, what do we do about that? Well, I'm really grateful for a book that I read about a month ago by Josh Packard. The book is titled Faithful Futures, Sacred Tools for Engaging Younger Generations, and it is packed with great research and some really helpful practices that we can engage in order to connect and build relationships with Gen Alpha and Gen Z. Let me tell you a little bit about Josh. Josh is a sociologist. He's a sought-after speaker. He's a consultant. He's co-founder of an organization called Future of Faith, which helps faith leaders expand and sustain relational ministries in today's changing cultural landscape. And as I mentioned, he's also the author of the book Faithful Futures, and I think you're really going to love this conversation. I'm Markus Watson, and this is episode 309 of Spiritual Life and Leadership. Josh, you say that emerging generations, this is from your book, emerging generations experience faith as a conversation rather than as a static state of being. And I'd love for you just sort of to explain what you mean by that.
Well, I'm not sure this is actually so different than previous generations, but I don't have data about previous generations. I just have the data about today's young people and teenagers. And I think we have tricked ourselves over time into thinking that faithfulness is a static category or identity that you occupy. Mm-hmm. And it's weird to me because I think we understand everything else about teenagers to be in flux, in exploration. They don't typically get married to the same person that they're dating in high school. They don't listen to the same music in their 40s that they did, when they were in middle school. And certainly I'm not the center fielder for the Texas Rangers, so I didn't get to be what I wanted to be when I grew up, even though I like my job very much. Yeah. So the hallmark of youth is change.
Yeah.
But it's like we set all of that aside when it comes to their faith lives, and we try to pretend like if we can just get them to occupy this category of faithfulness, then they'll never move off of it. And so we feel like our job is to drag them to this spot, and then they'll stay there. Instead, I think that's inconsistent with the way teenagers experience life in general, which is that sort of, especially in this social media driven, fragmented world, everything is a conversation.
Yeah.
And so what we say a lot, Future of Faith in general, and I write about in Faithful Futures, the book, is, the question isn't, are they going to explore? The question is, are you going to be there with them when they do?
Are you going to be there with them when you do? Which, okay, I'd be curious to explore a little bit more about the difference, like what's different about Gen Z and Gen Alpha. In some ways, what you're describing, like just thinking about back to my own youth and being involved in some youth ministries in my church and in college, Campus Crusade and those kinds of things.
Yeah.
the presence of other people was really important then as well, and having people who listen to me. So how has it changed, would you say, from, the 80s and 90s to today?
Well, the dynamics like haven't changed. I mean, like young people are still young people and have been young people more or less in
Yeah.
the same ways for the last half a century or more. Sort of as adolescence emerges post World War II, most significantly. What has changed are the conditions,
Hmm.
and I think it's really critical to understand that, like, while relationships have always been important. I mean, we just wrote this big white paper for the 10 by 10 movement, sort of
Mm.
tracing back the entire lineage of relational discipleship as a category um, over the last 50, 60, 70 years. And I
Yeah.
mean, look, it's been the same for the whole time. People have been saying this for decades, relationships,
Yeah.
relationships, relationships.
Yeah.
But the context in which we do relationship has altered dramatically. We've gone from a world that implicitly trusted our institutions and our institutional leaders. That's the world that my dad grew up in, and my grandfather's world, to the world we live in today, that we
Mhm.
call low trust world. That is like
Mm.
nobody really trusts institutions of any kind,
Right.
and that includes religious ones, and they don't trust their leaders, including pastors, priests, campus
Yeah.
ministers, etc. So the way that we do relationships in that context, I think, has to be most effective, needs to kind of shift a little bit to meet that new reality. And that's the world that our teenagers are growing up in.
Mm.
So the dynamics are still the same. Trusted adults still matter. Parents are still the
Yeah.
most influential thing in the faith lives of a young person. They're still asking big questions about what it means to be alive and the nature of God and the universe and
Mhm.
existence and all of this. But what has changed is that they're unlikely to take prepackaged answers from
Mm.
anybody and
Mhm.
just try and adopt them wholesale. Those
Yeah.
days are, if not over, at least they're not currently happening right now.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. I wanna ask more about that, and talk about, you have something called sacred listening theory. Um, uh, can you tell us a little bit, just sort of about the research that you have done, and kind of how you've dug into this, and just kind of an overview of the kinds of things that you've learned?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of this comes out of my experience having given, a lot of presentations, keynotes, and workshops and things in front of pastors and religious professionals, campus ministers, etc. And we would share all this data about the importance of relational ministry to connect with today's young people. And they would have two really good questions on the way back. That they would always say to me, like, okay, but my job isn't to form relationships. My job is to to make disciples, to share the good news, to save souls. Some version
Mhm.
of that, which is a good
Mhm.
reminder that the dependent variable here is a relationship with Jesus,
Mhm.
and that's the vehicles can change, but the dependent variable, the outcome remains the same. And then the second question I had was more pragmatic, which was, all right, how do we do relational ministry? It sounds all well and good, but I've got 300 students, for example, on my campus ministry. I can't, how do I do relational ministry with 300 students? So one question is really about what is the impact of listening and relational ministry, and the second question is about pragmatics and scale, and how do we get this done? And so that is what led us to some research at Future of Faith, which you can find for free on our website under the Sacred Listening Study. I think it's the only data in the world that documents the impact of listening on faith formation, showing that when you sit, and this is true for teenagers and adults actually, when you sit and listen to somebody, you're not building trust so that later you can help shape their faith. That is kind of
Mm.
happening. You are
Mhm.
building trust,
Mhm.
but you are also doing something deeply formative for their faith in that moment. And I think that's a really
Mm.
important piece of information to keep in mind. Like, this isn't a step along the way. This is the way.
Mm. Yeah.
I'm not sure I would have said that 20 or 30. I'm not sure the data would have said that
Mm.
20 or 30 years ago. But I think it's really reflective of this modern context where people need to know that you've heard them in order for
Yeah.
them to believe that you have their best interests in mind. And they
Yeah.
need to work things out because they're not willing to just take what's given to them from
Yeah.
sources that they don't inherently trust. And so listening becomes really critical.
Yeah.
But that second question of scale is, I think, absolutely spot on. It's weird to think about scale in ministry. We're not trying to change 300 hearts and souls. Like, we're trying to change
Mhm.
one at a time. Ideally, maybe on the way to 300. Who knows? But
Yeah.
the best ministers I know are really focused on that person in front of them. But we
Mm.
say a
Yeah.
lot, like, you cannot do 300. You can't do relational ministry with 300 people by having 300 cups of coffee every week.
Right. Right.
But we do think that if you have the right tools, then, and you know which three people need your attention this week, then you can do it
Mm,
across that many
yeah.
people. And that's where the sacred listening theory and tools come in. Is, we know there's probably a lot of answers to that question, but we
Yeah.
wanted to do our part to help
Yeah.
provide some.
Yeah.
And so with sacred listening theory and tools, we're bringing together really a system for how to get some key pieces of information so that you really can, do this as a ministry across not just the number of people you can hold in your head, but
Yeah. Yeah.
across an entire group.
Yeah. I love what you said. If you can, you said something like, if you can discern which three people need your
Yeah.
attention that week, right? All of a sudden, that sounds very doable. Um, so, what are I want to talk? So, I want to get to sacred listening theory. I want to get to scaling you mentioned, but How would you describe the challenge that churches are facing? We have and maybe kind of describe a little bit more about Gen Z and Gen Alpha. Talked about the loss of trust in institutions, but what are some of the challenges that churches face or need to address in their work with young people?
Well, I think we really have to get really clear about what it is that we ultimately care about, and that's why I thought it
Hmm.
was so useful for those ministers to be reminding me of ultimately what their outcomes are. We get caught up in process a lot, and sometimes like the process becomes a shorthand for good practice.
Yeah,
But when the world changes, then our processes can really get in the way. Um, so like the question is, why are we doing things the way that we're doing them? Sometimes there's good like
yeah,
theological and ecclesiological reasons for why, we organize Christian formation or education
yeah,
in a particular way through Sunday school or Wednesday
yeah,
night
yeah,
confirmation classes or what have you. But if we really dig into what goes on in a lot of congregational life with young people, a lot of it is kind of left over from stuff that's been around for 20 or 30 years because
yeah,
maybe it
yeah,
worked really well back then.
yeah, yeah,
And so we just keep hanging on to it, but it doesn't necessarily fit a modern context. So I think taking a hard look at what exactly are we trying to do
yeah,
and why are we doing it that way? Does that match the young people that we actually live
yeah,
with and are around on a daily basis?
yeah,
I'll tell you one of the things I think is probably the most difficult to manage in a modern world is this variable or this concept of time, right? Like I grew
mm,
up in the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America, the ELCA.
okay,
Confirmation happened between what was like sixth grade and eighth grade, if I
oh,
remember
yeah,
correctly. And I remember even then asking like, but what if somebody moves away or their parents get divorced or
mm,
they have a trauma in the family? And the answer was like,
mm,
confirmation happens between sixth grade and eighth grade. It's like
interesting,
everything
yeah,
fits into that container.
yeah,
And then flash forward now, 25, 30 years later, my wife is working with these kids who are experiencing profound trauma because of the neighborhoods that she's working in. The
mm,
idea of trying to fit their faith formation into a time container
yeah,
is preposterous. And I think
yeah,
COVID just exposed that even more. The
yeah,
developmental challenges through life stages that young people are experiencing. The concept of going from high school to college to a career that was never the dominant norm in the
mm,
first place. It's even less so now. I
mm,
mean, it just all of these time containers that are artificial that we think
mm,
like this thing has to happen now,
right,
as opposed to thinking about stages. Like, how
mm,
are we, to use a Catholic term, how are we accompanying you, through this phase of your life? And then what's coming next and how can we accompany you through that? I think that's a much, but the church isn't really built that way, right?
yeah,
Like we're
yeah,
built on grades and school years and,
yeah,
summer VBS programs and things. So I'm not suggesting we blow all that up. I get that that's too hard. But if we could let go of this time idea just a little bit and really
yeah,
meet young people, where they're at in their own
yeah,
development and recognizing that it's not linear, some of it's going
yeah,
to double back and
yeah,
things are going to happen in their lives. I think that would change our ministries for the better.
yeah. Uh, I I I love that. What I love about it is that the focus is on the person, being cared for, the kid, right? And what is happening in their lives? What are their needs? Where are they in their life journey, faith journey? And then and then adapting in a sense to that, rather than saying, "Here's our schedule. You need to get on our
Right.
schedule." Yeah, I love that. And so maybe that kind of leads into sacred listening theory, which is something that you talk about. Explain what you mean by sacred listening theory and how that fits into all this.
Well, we really do think that the data are pretty clear that in a world where nobody trusts institutions, um, it's not that trust has disappeared; it's just relocated. It's
Mm,
relocated down
mm,
to relationships that are rooted in listening, and that's important because, especially with young people, because
mm,
the implicit assumption on young people is that adults do not listen to them.
mm,
And so, as an adult, when you sit and listen to a young person, you're doing a lot of things, a lot of really productive things to sort of disrupt their expectations, change the
mm.
power dynamic a little bit, invite them in so that you can not just signal, like in a performative way, that you have their best interest in mind, but that you actually, then when it comes time for you to talk, you've done the work to know who they are so that what you're saying is actually for them and they
Yeah,
know it to be for
yeah.
them. And so, we think that that's really critical. But how do we do that, right? And I think that having a system that helps us do that is important more than just like an intent or a desire or a posture. So when we talk about sacred listening theory, what we're talking about really is like capital S, capital L. Sacred listening is a it's
Mhm.
a thing for us, and it's really three parts. The first is starting from a theological position of imago Dei. That is, that you see the person across from you as made in the image of God, just as you are also made in the image of God. And that when you have a conversation, the way I like to put it at its extreme to help
Yeah,
illustrate is like, even when your 14-year-old is talking to you about Minecraft for the millionth time, in some
yeah.
way, shape, or form, like that is God talking to you about
Right,
Minecraft. And if
right.
you can occupy that mindset,
Yeah,
that heart set, then we'll be starting from a very good place. Even
that's
though I
great.
recognize that that can be hard to do.
It's
Um,
sacrificial love, right?
that's right, because those conversations are not always the most engaging.
Uh-huh.
But we do think that theological posture and starting place is critical.
Yeah.
That being said, there are some really tangible communication skills, and so we turn to
Mm,
our colleagues in the communication sciences to help us understand what do we need to do to be good listeners.
mhm.
And really, what all of that research boils down to. I mean, if there's any comm scholars in the audience, they're going to like freak out. But I'm going to paint with a very broad brush here.
Yeah.
But if you had to sum it up, you would call it alignment.
Mm,
It's not so much that there's one good way to listen. A lot of us will think about active listening as the thing we're supposed to do, but that's not true for all people in all cultures in all
mhm.
groups. I mean, what the science really tells us is that you need to align yourself as a listener in a way that the person across from you feels heard. So again, I'll use my wife's work for example. I mean, she, as again, works with a lot of kids in trauma. If you were to like make eye contact and be giving verbal affirmation to them all the time, and to sit
Mm,
across from them in a posture where you're like
yeah,
facing them, I
yeah.
mean, this is incredibly threatening. It's going to shut down
Right,
every
right,
conversation.
right.
So that's what I mean. Like, some of it's cultural, some of it's life stage. Some of it is
Mhm.
based on events. Maybe texting is good for some groups. Maybe eye contact. Like, I grew up in a suburban white middle class household. What
Yeah,
eye contact is great for me, like
yeah.
nonverbal communication, all the stuff you're doing right now, Mark. Like, this is
Right.
signaling to me that you're locked in, but
Good.
that's really intimidating to a lot of other cultures and
Mm,
people. And so
mm.
we need to align our. We have to be empathetic enough to know
Yeah,
who we're listening to.
right.
Um, there was a theologian who said, we're trying to listen the other person into speech, into being. And that
Mm.
means that the job is not just on us to receive, but it's on us to be positioned in a way that makes them talk,
Yeah,
that makes them feel comfortable sharing.
yeah,
So
yeah.
that's really critical. The third part, though, is where we get to this idea of scale. And that's where my own
Mm,
discipline of sociology comes in. And this is what we call pattern recognition. And what we're really looking for here is, while you're doing that really good listening, centered in this posture of imago Dei, are you getting key pieces of information so that you can either share it out with others who can help disciple that person, or that you can keep track of so that you can get to this point where all right, these are the 5 cups of coffee this week. Not,
mm,
I don't have to
mhm.
50. I need
Yeah,
these are the
yeah,
five who need my attention right now. Because if we don't look for those key pieces of information,
yeah.
then all of our biases can come into play. I mean, I say this as a former teacher,
Mm,
right? In the classroom,
mm.
the easiest thing for me to do on a given day or week would be to listen, like keep calling on the students who I knew would, like I know would have good stuff to say, and they
Right,
were interesting, and like I
right,
wanted to hear from them, and I'm sure
right.
their classmates did too. But that wasn't always what was in service of the
Yeah,
entire class. And sometimes I did need to call on the students who I knew probably had something to say, but were just too shy to raise their hand. But they
yeah.
would have, essentially, if I could position it as a conversation with me in the classroom, then they would do it. But that meant that I had to know that student and I had to know something about how prepared they were. So I wasn't putting them on the spot for something that they
Yeah.
were, not equipped to do. And so it requires us to get those key pieces of information in some pretty systematic ways and
Yeah.
then to be very intentional about how we're following up on them.
Yeah.
And so that when we combine those three pieces, that's how we think of sacred listening. We built a whole set of tools around them, so you don't have to like guess how to do this. They're all free on our website. You can download them.
Nice.
But we encourage people to really adapt them for themselves in their own context because
Yeah.
we're just, we've made some that we think are useful, but other people are surely going to have, their own ministries to reflect in these tools.
Yeah. That's great. Can you name those three things again, just concisely? What were they? The three
Yep.
things you mentioned.
So the theological position of Imago Dei,
That's
the
right.
communication position of alignment, and the sociological position of pattern recognition.
Nice. Okay. Okay. And then you started talking about scaling. You talk about in the book scaling up, scaling out, and scaling down. Can you? And
Yeah.
I read your book like a month ago. Remind me what is that? But I have the notes about that. So remind me what those mean again.
No problem.
Yeah.
So normally when we think of scale, we think of scaling, sort of up. Like, how can we get bigger and bigger and bigger? And that is true. We want to be able to do this ministry with a lot of people. That is part of the challenge. But the way that we're going to get to scaling up, I mean, so let me start with the problem. I talked to a youth minister last year who said that he was terrified of asking any of his students anything about what they were doing or their lives because he had no way to remember it and wasn't going to be able to follow up on it.
Oh,
And they were going to think that then like he let them down because he didn't ask about their test or their football game or
interesting.
follow up on that death in the family or whatever.
Yeah.
And that just struck me as a tragedy. And
Yeah.
as we started surveying informally, just asking like on Facebook and in conferences, what tools do you use? Youth ministers would say, nothing. I just try to keep it in my head, which, if you're my age and your age, Marcus, like that's
Yeah.
a
Right.
terrifying prospect on its own.
I know. I know.
And the second thing that they said was, I use the Notes app in my iPhone, which is
Mhm.
not a very good tool. At least they're doing something, but not very good, right? And so that idea of like, we got to find some way to capture this information to this more systematically so that this when we're scaling up it's not built on the shaky foundation,
Mhm.
right? So we also then think about scaling out, which is that if you get these pieces of information and you know something about not only the young people that you serve but also the adults in your community, then you can connect them around very distinct and explicit asks. So like if my church, for example, were to come to me and say, hey Josh, can you hang out with the youth every Wednesday night from now until forever, essentially, because that's how church volunteering works.
Yeah.
My answer is like probably not. Like my son needs his own space, and also like I'm not in town a lot, and on and on. But if they were to come to me and say, "Hey, we have 3 kids graduating this year. You used to be a professor. They don't know what they want to major in. Could you just do some like, here's what college is. They're all first gen, and walk them through this." Man, I would do that all day,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
so that's what I mean by scaling out. But you have to know that about me and you have to know that about those kids. And that's where the sacred listening tools help to uncover some of those key pieces of information so that you can, beyond who you are as the youth minister in this case, you can connect them with other adults who could care about them. And if I were to have done that, I mean, I would still email them and follow up with them and all that.
Sure.
At the same time, man, we got to cut through the noise. I mean, so much of a young person's life on social media and other places can be really superficial. And the dreaded F word if you have kids. How was your day? Fine.
I mean, yeah.
Like, it's just really hard to get them. And so
Yeah.
in these tools, we built them to be formative and summative. And the formative part is unbelievable. We've used them over and over again, and it's incredible to me.
Mhm.
We go deeper faster than I would have ever thought
Yeah.
that we could do. And I'll give you one example here. The
Yeah.
mapping trusted relationships exercise
Mhm.
in about the span of about 25 or 30 minutes, we end up with a 3x5 note card where each person who's doing it, if you're doing it with youth in this case,
Uh-huh.
you have an understanding of their faith life, of all the trusted adults, if they want to have more conversations about faith and what they're interested in talking about.
Yeah.
And I had a youth minister say to me once, like, man, I spend the whole year trying to get this information. We just got it in 20 minutes. And now I've like,
Wow.
and the takeaway is like, what would you do if you had a stack of these on your desk, like one for every kid in your school or,
Mhm.
in your congregation? Because these tools are, really designed to create safe places that are set apart in a spiritual way that make people comfortable talking about some things that are, often inaccessible with
Yeah.
teenagers.
Yeah. Um, So, scaling up, scaling out, scaling down. And the one of the things that struck me was you're doing the sacred. In order to be able to do that, you're listening not only to kids, you're also listening to adults, right? And in your network, in your congregation, or wherever you are, right? So that you also know what matters to them, and you can connect the right kid with the right adult.
Ideally, I mean, I know that's a
Ideally,
challenge. Not
okay.
every congregation is built to do this, and not every. I mean, if we're talking here specifically to youth ministers, I do understand the very real challenge that a lot of times the biggest stumbling block to doing effective relational ministry is your boss. You know that your pastor or your executive pastor might not understand this, and so trying to do that. So ideally, yes, we're going to involve adults, and it's going to be a whole church effort. But I get too that there's sometimes this prevailing norm of like we hired a youth minister, you handle
Right,
them.
right. Well, okay. So then, how? Okay, maybe this is. I hope this fits our conversation. Kind of where we're. But like, okay, how do you? I mean, it sounds like you are. You're stressing, or um, you're saying that it's important to connect kids with adults, and if you're going to scale out, scale up and scale out. So, do you have any thoughts on how to overcome the hurdle of, well, it's your job, youth pastor? I know it's a little bit outside the scope of what your book is
No,
about, but I'm curious, yeah,
it is,
what
I
you think
think, a
about that.
critical question. It's one of the things that we have done some research around before, and Search Institute and others have, pointed out that really the critical number is five. Every young person
Yeah.
getting connected to five trusted adults. Fuller Youth Institute talks about this.
Hmm.
Once we get past five, it's better to have six, but it's not markedly better. Five is really the
Hmm.
magic number. Um, and so the first step for me would be, sharing some of that really critical research with
Hmm.
the other people on my staff,
Hmm.
and seeing if that helps to move the needle, or at least open up a conversation. Now, I understand, even as much as this pains me to say as a researcher, research doesn't change anybody's mind, right? I
Yeah.
wish it
Right.
did.
Right. 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 Right.
But I do think it can open up the doorway for a conversation about how we might be able to do this.
Yeah.
So that's probably where I would be inclined to start, and then
Hmm.
to try and run like a small experiment, like if there is resistance, to
Yeah.
say, what would you think if I just tried this with this year's confirmation class, or,
Yeah.
the Sunday school program, or the vacation, the VBS, 6 weeks in the summer, or whatever it is.
Hmm.
Um, can we, then see how it goes.
Yeah.
Uh, I do think you have to start small, because
Yeah.
again, like sometimes there can be real resistance there.
Yeah. Yeah. That's great. That's great. That's helpful. There's another quote that I really appreciated from the book. Let me read it to you, and then maybe you can unpack that for us. You said, "Success in ministry is no longer about converting the bad into the good." Meaning, I think bad people into good people, but you tell me what you mean by that. Uh, it's no longer about converting the bad into the good, but about guiding everyone through whatever challenges they may face while affirming their worth at every potential turn. Can you unpack that for us?
Well, I was not. Yeah, I mean, I think at its extreme, you can talk about bad people and good people. I'm not sure that that's something I subscribe to, and I don't think most people probably do either, especially when we're talking about teenagers.
Mm-hmm.
But what I do mean, more explicitly, where I think that there is some uh, divergence in thinking here, is this idea that somehow teenagers that they need help understanding that about the mistakes that they have made, or that the
Mm.
decisions that they have chosen, that are incorrect. And
Yeah.
the reality is, like, they know. I mean,
Yeah.
most of the time, it doesn't mean they're always going to do the right thing, but usually they
Yeah.
know when they're not doing the right thing, or when they haven't done the right thing in
Yeah.
retrospect. What's really hard to do, though, is to move forward through those mistakes if the adults in your life are not validating your worth as a human being in
Mm.
spite of those mistakes,
Yeah.
letting you know that they have also made similar kinds of mistakes in their own life and feel worthy. Although I do think that's possibly part of the difficulty, is that a lot of adults don't feel like they're worth much because of the mistakes
Mm-hmm.
that they've made, and that is
Mm.
its own kind of baggage to carry around. But it's really hard to do that work with teenagers if you don't feel
Yeah.
that way.
Yeah.
Um, so that's what I mean. Like, I think that in this highly relational world, what teenagers need is somebody to affirm, like, yeah, you're gonna screw up, and it's okay. And like, it's not that that thing that bad thing makes you a bad person. That these things can be separated, and also it doesn't mean that we quit trying. Like we
Yeah.
are always trying to live into the image that God has for us and the world that God is trying to make, and inviting young people into that never-ending story,
Mm.
giving them a sense of purpose in life in that regard, um, is, I think, is a beautiful thing in a world where teenagers often feel drifting and like
Yeah.
they're sort of unmoored because so many of our social institutions have kind of not collapsed, but they're not the same kinds of things that they once were.
Yeah. Yeah. What do if you were to sort of concisely, or well, say as much as you want, actually, but what do Gen Z and Gen Alpha, what do they think about church? Like, what kinds of words or phrases do they use when they
Mhm.
think about church?
Well, I think it's really important to understand that this is not a generation that left church. So we often talk about getting young people back to church. And I
Mm,
think, in its most
mm,
generous interpretation, what adults mean when they say that is, like previous generations. But at its
yeah,
most literal, I sometimes get worried that they are under the impression that these are the young people that somehow walked out. They didn't. They didn't
yeah,
leave church. Their parents left church, right?
right.
And so they're consequently, these young people, today's teenagers, are often growing up sort of without any experience whatsoever.
Yeah,
They don't dislike church as often as they nothing it. And that can be good and bad. It means that they're
hmm,
not often carrying around a lot of that baggage. Um, but it can be a bigger chasm to cross. If
hmm,
if you have lived inside of the church for your whole life, like I have, since I was in middle school, essentially, and
yeah,
I've, off, I know when I look at a church, I can picture what is happening inside, right?
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Um, but they can't.
yeah,
I when I taught sociology of religion, I used to take my students to a mosque and a synagogue and to a
mm,
church on field trips, and whenever we could get into them. And it was interesting watching how it evolved over the years. At first, most of my students like felt comfortable inside of a church, and they would walk
mm,
around and explore in the way that you would expect them to. And when we walked into a synagogue, though, they would stand right in the front door
mm,
because they didn't know what they were encountering or where anything was, and they didn't want to be disrespectful, and so they would just stay right there. Um, as time went on, that became increasingly the way that they interacted in all those spaces because
mm,
they don't know what a narthex is,
right.
or a
Yeah,
sanctuary.
right.
So imagine how, like, that is a hard chasm to cross for us
Yeah,
to imagine what it's like for somebody to not even know what goes on literally past the front door, let alone the language and like how to read a Bible. Or if you say,
hmm,
turn to John 3:16, nobody knows what those numbers mean anymore. They
right,
might not even know that John is a book of the Bible or that the
right.
Bible has books. And they may just know they have this curiosity about something transcendent or bigger than themselves, or a connection that they feel to the universe, as they might explain it. So they're lacking in a lot of cases, like the basic grammar of faith. And we need to reorient our ministries that way, not to be like tour guides, because they're not asking to know what a narthex is, but like,
Yeah, right.
can we answer their questions, not answer the questions we want them to be asking of us? And
Hmm,
that's a pretty, it's a leap we can cross. And I think it is our
yeah,
job to do it. It is not the teenager's job to do it. It's ours.
mm,
But it is a big leap. And I want to
yeah,
recognize that, to know that we have to come to them in a much more humble posture, I think, than we have
mm,
come in the past, where, I don't know about you, but like, some of us were required to memorize Bible verses and to,
hmm,
know the catechism and to take tests on things.
yeah,
And maybe there's still a time and a place for that. But increasingly, that time and place is not upon first meeting them. Like
yeah,
that, it's
yeah,
just the starting place is much more basic than that,
right, right.
for today's kids.
Yeah. Um, I'm trying to remember something you just said that sparked a thought. Um, well, anyway, uh, I guess the question I have then. Oh, humility. That's what you said. Come with humility, and so my question is, like that reflects a posture with which we come to kids,
Mm,
and as pastors, and not just youth pastors, but also pastors and ministry leaders, I mean, lay leaders in the congregation. There is this sense that, well, we have the answers and we
yeah.
know the kinds of behaviors that good Christians should have. And so we're
Mhm.
going to do whatever we can to get you to behave and believe the things that we know you have to behave and believe. But there's not a lot of humility in that, at least
No, I
when I think
suppose
of it
not.
in that way. So I guess do you have any thoughts on how to develop the kind of posture that we as adult leaders in the church need in order to connect with youth in the way that they need it?
Well, I think that being curious is the most
Mm,
like disruptive thing that you can do for that
mm,
dynamic. And being
yeah,
curious, by the way, is when we did our study about listening, that was the number one thing that people said makes up a good listener. The
yeah,
number one thing, by the way, they said makes up a bad listener is being judgmental. And I think those two things are fundamentally at odds. Like it's really hard to be curious and judgmental at the same time, right?
yeah, 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 yeah,
uh, if you are genuinely curious about somebody else's life and you can convey that to them by asking actual questions and following up and wanting to know more, um, it's really hard then to
mm,
also not be humble. I mean, to come at them and say, this is the way things are. Curiosity puts you in a posture of receiving them, receiving the other, um, feeling like you have all the knowledge and the right answer
hmm,
to every question that even hasn't been asked yet, sort of is the opposite of
yeah,
that. It
yeah,
puts you in a position of maybe you're listening so that you're just buying time so that you can then talk, and that
yeah,
is not being curious, right? That's not
right,
fundamentally that's not being
right,
relational.
right,
Um, so if there was one thing that like helps us to maintain that posture of um, of humbleness
hmm,
in relational ministry with the other, I think it starts with curiosity. But
mm,
curiosity is really hard to sustain. I think a lot of us think it's like a trait, like a person, either is or tall or is short. They are
yeah,
curious or they're not. But it's
mm,
more than just willpower. I mean, I think it helps to have real experience and skills and to understand that this is sort of like developing any skill or habit or
yeah.
trait. It takes time and it takes practice.
Can I ask how you have developed curiosity, the skill of curiosity? What are some? Have you done some things to develop that? What? How have you developed that?
Well, the research has, I mean, I am one of the weird people where like the research actually does sort of change my behavior, or at least I like to think that it
Yeah.
does. So you see right behind me, if you're watching this on video, you can see on my dry erase board,
Uh-huh.
I have this, our catchphrase here, listening is sacred.
Uh-huh.
And I joke around that like I have it there in part because it's our tagline at Future of Faith. And
Mm.
also I do a lot of video calls like
Yeah.
this podcast. I do a lot of keynote, even,
Yeah.
webinar things.
Yeah.
Um, and that sitting over my shoulder in my own, like I can see it in my own camera, and
Uh-huh.
so that is like a daily reminder to me of like, Josh, shut
Mm.
up. Josh, shut up. Like, when you're asked to
Mm.
talk a lot, like on a podcast, or
Yeah.
if you're giving a keynote, you have to talk. Like that's the deal.
Yeah. Yeah.
But you can, I think, fall into the habit then of thinking that you should always be the person talking. And I actually think this is where a lot of pastors have ended up, is that they've been asked and trained to talk so much, either in a sermon or in a meeting with their counsel or in a Christian education class or what have you. They're
Mhm.
talking all the time. It
Yeah.
without a subtle reminder, it can be hard to shift out of that mindset and realize that
Yeah.
the thing you need to do now is to be quiet, ask good
Yeah.
questions, write down
Yeah.
information, and listen. So that's my like little like
Yeah.
nudge, right? Like
I love it.
right over
I
my
love it.
shoulder. Uh, which I get that I'm violating like crazy in a podcast.
No, well, this is your job right now is to
Yeah, right,
I'll
right,
do the
right.
listening, you do the talking. Okay, good, good. Well, I love that. Be curious, not judgmental, which reminds me of Ted Lasso, which I
And
just
that's the
recently
poster I
watched.
have on this side of
Oh,
my
it is?
like on the wall over
Oh,
here is a Ted Lasso poster that says "Be curious." Not, I love that
I
scene.
love it, love it, love it, love it. Um, Let me ask you about one sort of one last topic from that you talk about in the book, and that is the topic of loneliness. You talk about this being the loneliest generation, and yeah, can you just kind of tell us a little bit about that?
Well, this is pretty clear and conclusive research
Mhm.
now, going back about a decade or so, that we've been tracking. I mean, social scientists broadly have been tracking that young people are the loneliest generation. So
Mhm.
there's a standard metric that UCLA developed. Some researchers out of UCLA developed in the late '70s to sort of measure what loneliness is,
Mhm.
and it's been used a lot over the last 40, 50 years. And always it was the oldest cohort, the oldest generation. Whenever there was a national study, they would be the ones that were the loneliest. You could probably sort of guess why. I mean, they're
Mhm.
leaving careers a lot of times, their health is dwindling, so maybe they're not going out as much, their friends might be
Mhm.
dying, passing on.
Yeah.
um, and that makes, and we're not that anybody's okay with that, but at least it was understandable.
Hmm.
And we could design and do some things to help mitigate it and support our elderly neighbors as they're going through that stage so that
Yeah.
they don't have to experience it quite so acutely. The teenagers, on the other hand, like were relatively fine. I mean, they're in
Hmm.
school all the time with other teenagers. Like,
Yeah.
like they're
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
clubs and sports and, on the phone if you're, me as a teenager all the time with friends.
Yeah.
And so it was stunning in like, what was it, 2015, 2016, when Cigna, the big health conglomerate, did a
Mm.
study and found that it was teenagers who were the loneliest. And now
Yeah.
we've been tracking, every year since, more or less, teenagers have been the loneliest of all the groups, and
Mm.
their objective scores were higher than we had ever measured. So it wasn't just
Wow.
that everybody was getting more connected. It was actually
Yeah.
that they were experiencing these dramatic levels of isolation. The Surgeon General has picked this up, and loads of other research. It's, loneliness is more deadly than cigarettes in some
Wow.
studies. I mean, it really has dramatic effects on your health and happiness, and
Yeah.
even your actual lifespan and health outcomes. So wrapping our heads around that is like
Yeah.
wild, I think, as an adult. Like,
Yeah.
to me, it's incredible that that would happen.
Right.
um I watched it unfold on college campuses where I thought would be the last place that could possibly be.
Mm.
Some campus ministries came to me when I was a professor and said, can we do a survey of the students on campus? And they wanted to know how many meaningful conversations they had in a day. And the
Mm.
students who worked in my research lab said, well, the first option that we give better be zero. And I said, nobody's
Mm.
having zero meaningful. You live on a college
Mm.
campus, like it's
Yeah.
residential. You're going to classes with these students. And they said, oh, no, no, no. They said, it's like there are students in their dorms all day. They leave to go to class with headphones on. They
Mm.
go and pick up their food to go from the cafeteria, and they go back to their dorm room. And I told
Mm.
them, I was like, okay, look, if we'll put it on there because I want you to see how wrong you are. And
Hmm.
if zero is even in the top three categories, I'll buy you all Starbucks. And the
Yeah.
results came in, and I spent like $180 on 4 lattes because I was
Mhm.
dead wrong. Zero was like the second most given answer. And that, I think, upends a lot of the ways that we think about ministry.
Yeah.
And what I mean by that is that, like, the things that fuel that loneliness epidemic around around anxiety to be around others, lack of actual social skills, in some ways enhanced by COVID,
Yeah.
and like being,
Mm.
online all the time, where you don't have to be at that same position of vulnerability as in person. Well,
Right.
all of that is sort of counter to the way that, for example, ministry was when I was in college. The campus ministry just invited us all to a gathering with music and pizza, and then they're going to talk about the Bible a little bit. But
Yeah.
I was like, there are girls there and free food.
Right.
I'm in, right?
Right.
And now, if you think about how loneliness manifests with people, and you try to come to a bunch of teenagers and say, hey, are you interested in gathering with a bunch of strangers, some of whom might be potential dates for you, and also
Mm.
hear about this religion that you don't have any experience with?
Right.
I mean, nothing's more
Right.
terrifying
Right.
than
Right.
that.
Right.
And so, what I mean by like loneliness upending our ministry models
Mm.
is that it is actually more comfortable to be alone, even if it is more detrimental in the long run. And so we've got to do some things to really break through that, because on any like day to day or moment to moment, the safest thing often for a teenager to feel like they can do is just to be in my own bubble, controlling
Yeah.
my own environment.
Yeah. Yeah.
But we know that that's not where the body of Christ is. The body of Christ is wherever two or more are gathered, and we know that that's not what's in their best, interest long term, for their health and spirituality, and a load of other things. And so I think we are called as ministers to do, to meet that challenge.
Yeah. Yeah. And do you have any thoughts? You said we need to do some things to break through. And maybe we don't know yet what those things are. Maybe it's just listening, but do you have any thoughts on at least some steps we can take to make those connections with the loneliest ones?
Well, there are already some like amazingly innovative things happening. And I think that they are often happening in campus ministries that are, a little bit, sort of on the edge, like they're
Mhm.
often rooted to a local church or to a larger body, but they have a little bit more freedom. And I think parachurch ministries like Young Life and Youth for Christ are also
Mm.
doing some really good work in this regard,
Yeah.
where the whole thing is relational. They
Yeah.
really are just trying to get to know you. And
Yep.
in fact, I had some guys from the Catholic campus ministry say, we used to start our year would start with a party. This is the model I grew up in.
Mhm.
And then out of that, we would get a bunch of names and phone numbers, and we'd spend the rest of the
Yeah.
year, getting to know them. And they said, we've completely flipped that. Now we spend the whole
Mm.
year getting to know people. We throw a big party at the end. But by then it feels like they're all just coming home for dinner.
Huh.
They're all with people because
Yeah.
systematically over the year, we've connected them to each other in small
Yeah.
ways that are sort of laddering up to each other. And so
Hmm.
coming to a gathering at the end doesn't feel intimidating to them. It feels like, exciting. And so I think a lot of those, we can take a lot of those lessons and move them into sort of the institutional church, not just with
Yeah.
young people, but also even with adults of like,
Yeah.
are we
Hmm.
systematically being the first point of connection maybe, but then moving them to others and moving them to others and moving them to others,
Yeah.
because that's the way, that's the way community gets built, is in this
Yeah.
chain referral way. And
Yeah.
that's the way that communities of faith get sustained.
Yeah. 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 That's good. That's good. That's helpful. It is interesting how the way you described it, it's sort of this flip, and it from anyway, getting to know kids throughout the year, and then the party at the it just means what it says to me is I have a lot to learn, right, as an adult, and I need to let go of my assumptions of how effective ministry is done, and learn from people like you, and learn from the people you're studying. That sounds very I
Yeah.
don't like how I said that, but learn from the people that we're called to love, the younger people. Let me
Mm.
just ask you if this has been really good, really helpful. If anybody wanted to connect with you or find out more about the work that you're doing, where could they go?
Yeah, thanks. So the book is Faithful Futures. And so that website is faithfulfuturesbook.com. We're really trying to, practice what we preach there. So the book launch is trying to be relational. If you know somebody who could use a copy of the book, we'll send them one for free. Just go on
Hmm.
the website, send me a note, and we'll send out a book. And if you know somebody doing something amazing in youth ministry, you can drop a line and we'll just send them money, cash,
Yeah.
for doing good things.
Hmm.
As we try to give back for, a lot of, when I get booked to speak, I tithe back into this fund, a
Hmm.
portion of those revenue. But you can also find the sacred listening tools at futurefaith.org. And
Yeah.
look, we're not here to tell you that the way you're doing ministry is wrong, or that you need to blow it up and do something completely different. We've really tried to design these very analog, lo-fi, they're PDFs that you download and exercises that you walk through. They're designed because we recognize that a lot of this is incremental. You want to do this alongside of some stuff that is still really working for you. And please do. Like, we're not suggesting to stop all the stuff and do it this other way. We really just want to nudge people with some tools to maybe become a little more relational and see what kind of a difference it can make.
Yeah. Yeah. And let me just say, I think the book is great. I read, there's some books that I skim and I'm like, okay, yeah, I've heard this and this and this. And anyway, I have more underlining in this book than than I have in a long time. And so, and I recommended it to our youth and children's ministry director, partly not just because of the content, but also you have some really great activities that you can do just to do sacred listening and to get to know the kids in your church or your community. So anyway, I really, really appreciate that.
Well, thank you, Markus.
Yeah, Josh, thanks so much for being here. Really enjoy this conversation, and just thank you for all the good work that you're doing.
I appreciate it. It's been a lovely chat.
Well, thanks for listening. If this episode was helpful, I hope that you'll share it with another leader who needs to hear it. And if you want to go deeper on helping your church engage in God's mission in the way that your church is uniquely called and wired to reach your neighborhood, I want to invite you to grab a copy of my book, Beyond Thingification, on Amazon. And you can also get a free study guide at markuswatson.com/book. The music that you hear on this podcast is by my good friend and partner in ministry, Derek Rice, and you can find his worship music on all of your favorite streaming platforms. Well, thanks so much for being part of this community, and I will see you next time here on Spiritual Life and Leadership.